With Shadowlands just around the corner and a whole bunch of new players starting their World of Warcraft journey, I thought it might be useful to talk about one of the very first choices that you're going to make when you start playing. That is the race of your character. As you can see from the title, this is part 2 of the guide covering the Horde Races, and I'll link to part 1 that covers the Alliance races in the description down below. That video actually talked a bit more about why race choice is important in WoW, so I'd recommend watching that first even if you do intend to play Horde. However, the TLDR is that unless you're in the top 1% of players, the relative performance of each race in terms of raw damage or healing output is going to be pretty much irrelevant to you. But what is important is that you understand what each race is capable of when it comes to their abilities, what situations certain races are going to excel in, and whether you can get on board with the fantasy that surrounds that particular race. Ultimately, I think you should pick what you think is cool, but to get excited about a race in the first place, you kind of need to understand what they can do. So in this video, we're going to go through each of the Horde races, talk about their racial abilities, give some examples of where they might be useful, and hopefully in doing so help you make your decision on which race you want to play in WoW. Let's start with Orcs. Now, they have a racial ability called Blood Fury that increases attack power and intellect by a flat amount for 15 seconds. The amount is going to depend on your level. Basically, it's a 15-second buff to your damage or healing output, regardless of the class that you're playing. This can come in handy when you need to pull out all of the stops to burst down a player or a boss, for example. How does this compare to other races? Well, you could look at simulations, but you're very quickly going to notice that the differences are very minor, and these differences are going to change throughout an expansion based on how the abilities of each race scale and the type of encounter that you're facing. So rather than worrying about the difference in output, I'd be more inclined to decide whether you like the ability of being able to activate Blood Fury for a slightly better on-demand burst, or whether you'd rather not have an extra ability as a beginner, and instead of having that extra button to press, you might want to have one of the flat damage increasing abilities from another race. And we'll get onto that, but an example would be the Tauren bonus to critical strike, for example. Of course, in most scenarios, the active ability, Blood Fury, is going to perform better, but unless you're a Mythic Raider, then the difference just isn't really going to matter that much. Orcs also benefit from the passive racial Hardiness, and this is where all duration of stun effects is reduced by an additional 20%. Now, this is actually a very powerful racial, particularly in a PvP environment where this reduction in stun could easily make the difference between victory and defeat. This is especially true in Arena, where that extra second could easily be what you need to pop a defensive or to get out of the way of a massive bit of burst damage that's coming in from your opponent. What's interesting about Hardiness is that it's actually very similar to one of the PvP talents called Relentless. While Relentless applies to all crowd control effects rather than just stuns, stuns are definitely one of the more difficult ones to deal with, as unlike many other forms of crowd control, your enemy can actually continue to deal damage to you while you're stunned, unlike if you were sapped or polymorphed, for example. Now, for total beginners, PvP talents are basically a set of active or passive abilities that activate when you engage in PvP. There are currently 4 PvP talent slots, and you're able to pick from a range of talents for each of these slots. Now, the first slot offers the same 3 choices to every race and class. This is the slot that the Relentless talent sits in, and due to the fact that Orcs have a very similar baseline talent to reduce stun by 20%, you can happily pick one of the other PvP talents for that slot, as you're not losing out in the way that other races are. Humans have a very similar thing, as their Will to Survive ability offers something similar to Gladiator's Medallion, for example. Again, that's another one of the 3 talents that sit on that first row of PvP talents. Again, it's a weaker version as it doesn't cover as many crowd control effects, but it makes the alternative PvP talent choice a lot more viable. Anyway, the point is that it's a very strong PvP talent, and it can't harm in PvE either, as you're still going to be stunned in PvE encounters, and basically the less time you spend stunned, the less likely you are to be killed by something that you can't avoid. Then finally you have Command, which is another passive ability that increases damage dealt by pets by 1%. This is a nice little bonus if you're a hunter or a warlock, or I suppose an unholy DK or a frost mage. The problem with this talent is that it's useless to other classes, such as warriors, for example. It's also the case that a lot of other classes have racial passives that boost their primary or secondary stats, effectively upping their damage without limiting it to only pet classes. It does add a bit of flavour though, portraying the Orcs as the beastmasters that they're supposed to be, and considering how good the other Orc racials are, it's hardly a big cause for concern. Let's move on to our next race, the Undead. Their big feature ability is Will of the Forsaken, and this allows them to shake off any charm, fear or sleep effects. And it's definitely one of the more powerful racial active abilities offered to any race. It's similar to the human Will to Survive if you watched part 1, apart from it works on different types of crowd control. Once again, its main advantage is seen in PvP, as it can save you from some absolutely dire situations and definitely be the difference between life and death. And like the human ability, it's basically offering a sort of downgraded gladiator's medallion, making it more viable for you to pick one of the other PvP talents on that first row that we talked about. For example, you could take Relentless, which gives you that extra 20% reduced duration to incoming crowd control effects. Once again, it has PvE implications as well. There are plenty of encounters where you're going to be feared, charmed, or put to sleep, and Will of the Forsaken is going to provide you with a way out of that other races won't have. Overall, I think this is one of the best ratios in the game and has been for a long time, to be frank. Oh yeah, and on top of that, it also lets you breathe underwater indefinitely, which isn't going to come in handy very often, to be honest, but it's there and it's kind of cool. It adds some RP flavour. Undead also benefit from a 1% resistance to shadow magic. Now, this is pretty minor. Most races have some form of minor resistance that's useful in very niche scenarios. For example, you'd take 1% less damage from a Warlock's Shadow Bolt, and you'd fare slightly better in a shadow-based boss encounter. But yeah, this is minor stuff and certainly not something you should worry about when picking your race. The Forsaken actually have a second active ability called Cannibalize, which is a rather grisly means for the Forsaken to replenish their health by consuming dead bodies. Specifically, you get 7% of your health every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. It's kind of a messed up ability, but it's pretty handy if you're desperate to recover health. You might be in the middle of a battleground, for example, after having just killed an enemy and you need to quickly recover some health before rejoining the fight. Or you might simply be out questing in the open world and you forgot to bring food with you. Bear in mind though that moving or taking damage will break the effect. And then finally, the Undead have another racial passive ability called Touch of the Grave. This is where the Forsaken can sometimes drain the life from their enemies and use it to repair their own bodies. Basically, it's a little bit of damage and a little bit of self-heal or leech, and it'll be for a flat amount based on your level. Now you can't really rely on it because it's a passive, you can't control when it's going to go off, but it certainly doesn't harm to have it. Throughout the course of any fight, it's going to benefit you in one way or another. Again, it's just another solid racial that makes Undead, in my opinion, one of the strongest sets of racials in the game. Of course, like we've said all along, strong versus weak in terms of racials isn't a massive rift. It is to high tier players, don't get me wrong, because the 1% is crucial for them, but I'd suggest that the rest of us pick something that seems most fun, and a character that we think is cool to look at. Next up are the Tauren, who first of all get a 2% bonus to critical strike damage and healing through the Brawn passive. Just to be clear, this is a bonus to the critical hit itself, not an increased chance to critically hit. In terms of its impact on gameplay, it's basically a flat increase to your damage or healing output. It will be a greater benefit to classes that are more reliant on crits than it will to those who aren't, but that's not really a long-term strategy, as Blizzard could very easily change the way a class works at any moment. And also, it's not going to sim far off other races anyway, so yeah, not one to stress over. They also receive a bonus to the herbalism profession. This increases their skill by 15 and it allows them to gather herbs faster than normal herbalists. This is the first profession-based racial that we're talking about on the Horde side, but there will be loads of them as you'll see as we go through the video. A boost to skill and speed like this is pretty typical and basically saves you some time and money, but it doesn't change what you can actually make with that particular profession. So it's really a convenience feature and I suppose a bit of RP flavour, as Taurens have an affinity with nature in the lore, so herbalism kind of makes sense. And I'll emphasise again that RP immersion is a perfectly good reason to pick a race. This is an RPG after all. In fact, make sure you read the lore if you're into that kind of thing. There's tons of it all over the internet and there's a bunch of Warcraft novels, so yeah, get stuck into that if that's your kind of thing. The next passive that the Tauren benefit from is a flat increase to their stamina, and again this scales with their level. So it's basically a boost to your health pool, which is nice for any class really, as a little extra health can only really be a good thing. And of course it's extra relevant to tanks whose entire job is to absorb and mitigate damage. Obviously it's going to be by a pretty minor amount, otherwise the ratio would just be too powerful. So while it's nice to have, it shouldn't make or break your race choice. And that's even if you are a tank, as many races' active abilities will be far more useful in tanking situations than having a little bit of extra health, including the Tauren one actually. Before we talk about that though, I'll quickly mention that Taurens get a 1% resistance to nature damage. As I said before, this is typical for many classes and the resistance is usually thematic. Again, Taurens have a nature theme and there's really not much else to say about this ability. So let's move on to the big one, War Stomp. This is an active ability that stuns up to 5 enemies within an 8-yard radius for 2 seconds. Now having an extra stun like this is always strong. It can be used both offensively and defensively, and the fact that it's an AoE stun makes it even more impactful in a lot of situations. For example, if you're in the thick of the melee during a battleground, you could potentially stun half the enemy team for 2 seconds at a critical point in the fight, which could very easily turn the tide of the battle. Or you might be in a PvE encounter and be able to stun a group of enemies who are dealing heavy damage to you or your team, allowing your healer a couple of seconds to get in that vital heal and prevent your party from being wiped out. It's one of those abilities that certainly is relevant to all classes, however you could argue that it's stronger for melee as it's lower risk, essentially because ranged characters don't really want to be that close to the enemy if they can help it. But saying that, it's also really nice if someone does catch up to you as a ranged, as you'll have a means to peel them off yourself for a couple of seconds. Basically, it can provide a great offensive or defensive stun depending on your circumstances. Okay, moving on to Trolls. Their first passive ability is Regeneration, which allows them an increased health regeneration rate of 10% out of combat, as well as allowing 10% of total health regeneration to continue during combat. This is unlike other races who don't have any health regen while in combat. This of course makes the healer's life slightly easier, and the longer an engagement goes on, the more benefit Trolls are going to get from this passive regeneration. It's also a convenience feature when questing in the open world, as you're going to regenerate a little faster between fights as well as during them. This saves a bit of time and a bit of money on food over the course of the many hours you play. It's a nice trait, no doubt about it. Then you also have 20% increased experience gains from killing beasts. This one's pretty niche to be honest, and while there are a lot of beasts in the game, so you will benefit, I wouldn't suggest pursuing some beast oriented leveling strategy just because you have this bonus as a troll. I'd definitely put this one on the list of the lower impact racials. Berserking, however, is fairly high on my list of the most impactful racials. This active ability increases your haste by 15% for 10 seconds, which essentially provides a boost to your damage or healing output during that 10-second period. This is without doubt powerful, as it's given you some extra on-demand burst potential that other races simply don't have, at least not through racial abilities. This could help you push a difficult phase in a boss fight or potentially drop a player in PvP. If it's a really close call, then this could be the ability that makes the difference to that fight. Again, it's not make or break unless you're in the absolute top tier of players, and of course that landscape is constantly shifting, but I'd say that it has more impact even at beginner or intermediate level than some of the other active abilities, so it's definitely one worth considering. And finally, Trolls benefit from a 20% reduction to the duration of all movement impairing effects. As with the Undead's Will of the Forsaken and the Orcs' Hardiness, this is a really nice PvP ability that's going to also give you some decent PvE mileage. It's the same principle of the other races' talents that we've talked about, as it is basically a weaker version of the PvP Relentless talent, in the sense that it offers part of what Relentless offers. Then on the PvE side of the house, it's just going to help you deal with the many movement impairing effects that you're going to encounter, just making it a little easier for you to do things such as, well, avoid damage for example. I'd definitely consider Trolls to be one of the stronger races when it comes to racial abilities. The next race on our list are the Blood Elves, who firstly possess a passive talent that gives them a 1% bonus to their critical strike chance. As you may have realised by this point, especially if you watched part 1 of the guide, this is very similar, if not exactly the same, as some of the passives received by other races. Blood Elves also have the active ability Arcane Torrent, and this removes one beneficial effect from all enemies within 8 yards, and it restores some of your own resource. So for example, if you're a mana user, it restores 3% of your mana, if you use energy, it gives you 15 energy, and so on. Of course these numbers are subject to change as Blizzard redesign classes, but you get the idea. This removal effect can be helpful in niche situations in dungeons and raids. For example, a group of enemies might have a shield on them or a buff making them more powerful, and you'll be able to remove that, in some circumstances that is. And of course the extra resource could come in handy as well, giving you a little bit of extra mana for healing for example. Not a huge amount, but it's still something. Then you could have some more niche examples. For example, you could extend the duration of Breath of Sindragosa as a Death Knight. Again, don't worry if you have no idea what that means. Basically, it's an ability that continues to channel and do damage while you still have resource. Therefore, by giving yourself a little bit more resource, it'll go on for a little longer. During PvP, Arcane Torrent can also provide you with that little bit of extra resource you need to finish off your opponent, or of course remove a beneficial effect that the opponent was relying on. In my personal opinion, it's not that impactful on PvP when comparing it to the other racial abilities, although potentially it could be really annoying for a healer in Arena, especially if they were facing multiple Blood Elves. Blood Elves also have a profession-based racial that offers plus 10 skill in Enchanting, which as we said for the previous profession bonuses can basically save you some time and resource. And finally, they have a 1% resistance to arcane damage. Moving on to Goblins, whose first racial active ability is Rocket Jump. This basically allows goblins to launch themselves over short distances. It can be beneficial as a gap closer or an escape, and I think you can even use it to stop you from taking full damage if you do it just before you land. It certainly used to allow you to do that anyway. Be careful if you're a goblin mage though, as slow fall can't be used for 10 seconds after using rocket jump. Now I assume this is basically to stop people from rocket jumping into a slow fall and therefore managing to access areas that they're not supposed to. I don't know. You also have another active ability that allows you to use your rocket belt to launch rockets at the enemy, causing a small amount of fire damage. What can I say about this one? It's a bit of extra damage if you're desperate. It's certainly not game changing, but in a close call I suppose it could kill a player or help towards downing a boss in PvE. The fact that it's ranged also makes it handy for certain classes who otherwise don't really have a ranged way of doing damage. You could launch it at someone as they were running away, for example. It's not the best active ability, to be honest. A really cool thing that goblins do have though is the ability to access their bank vault from anywhere. They can summon a little helper who essentially will allow you to interact with them as a banker, which is actually incredibly convenient. For example, if you forgot to take your consumables for a raid, or you realise that your bags are full and you want to use your bank as a form of temporary storage that will then allow you to continue what you were trying to do rather than having to go back to the city. There are basically loads of different uses for this, and I actually think it's one of the best convenience-based ratios in the game, and it applies universally to all classes as well. In terms of passives, goblins are considered great negotiators, which provides some of the best possible gold discount from all vendors, regardless of faction reputation. Basically, this is an overall gold saving when playing a goblin character. It's not massive, but over the course of playing the character for many months or years, it will add up. They also have a 1% bonus to haste, which again is one of those flat increases that most races have. And finally, their natural affinity for hazardous materials gives them a 15-point bonus to alchemy. And we've already talked about the minor advantage provided by professions bonuses, so let's move on to our next race. Now, we've gone through the Pandaren already in part 1, but I'll go through it again for those of you who are only interested in the Horde races. If you have watched part 1, then just use the timestamps to skip to the next section on the Nightborne. Now, the next race on our list is actually quite unique, and what makes them unique, apart from the fact that they're massive pandas, is that their first passive trait is faction neutral, which allows them to pick either Alliance or Horde. And this is a choice that's enabled once a Pandaren character finishes the starting zone. I'm not sure what else to say on this one. I guess it's great if you're really into pandas and playing both factions. Maybe Blizzard just didn't feel like developing 2 new races for the Mr. Pandaren expansion, I don't know. More significantly, as a Pandaren, you get double the stats from the well-fed effect after eating food that provides a stat bonus. So for beginners, well-fed is something that you're going to use a lot in dungeons and raids to boost your most important stats. And the vast majority of guilds will consider it mandatory for all raid members to bring food that provides the well-fed bonus. So getting double the benefit is a pretty nice passive. Do note though that there's a trade-off, as Pandarens don't have that flat stat increase passive that we've seen with a lot of the other races. And I think this is just Blizzard trying to make the passives a little bit more interesting, without throwing the balance out to a crazy degree. Because like we said before, the flat passives were getting, pretty repetitive. Again though, this isn't going to sim much differently to the other passive effects, so don't worry about it too much, don't over-focus on it. You also get plus 15 skill for the cooking profession, again, saves a little time and gold. You get twice the amount of rested experience as a panda, which is actually pretty handy for casual players who take long breaks between play sessions. Basically the rested effect gives you double experience gains, and the amount of rested experience you have accumulates whilst you're offline. You just have to make sure that your character is rested before you log out, and this happens in cities and inns. Once you're at max level, of course, this trait does become utterly useless. Another passive bonus for Pandaren is due to your roly-poly bouncy form, you actually take less damage when you fall. Specifically, you take 50% as much damage as other races. Niche, but it has some uses. And finally, the big active ability for the Pandaren is Quaking Palm. This strikes the target with lightning speed, incapacitating them for 4 seconds. Now the key word here is incapacitate. This isn't a stun and damage is going to break it. An example of a similar effect you might have seen if you've played before is the Rogue Sap, which will be broken by damage. This one can be a really powerful racial, but it takes a little practice to get right. For example, you can't just use it on an enemy who's taking damage per second from something like a Warlock's Curse or a Mage's Ignite. Whereas a stun, such as, the Paladin's Hammer of Justice, would allow for this. It'd stun them regardless of whether they were taking ticking damage every second. If you were to use this in Arena, for example, then you'd need to communicate your intention to use this ability with your teammates, and this would make sure that your partner didn't mistakenly damage the target and totally waste the effect. Another thing to note here is that Quaking Palm has a short range. So it's going to be a lot more easy to use for a warrior or a monk than, say, a hunter, for example. Because these classes are naturally going to be in melee range, and for a ranged class, that's obviously a lot more dangerous to do. So actually, that's an example of a race class synergy and a reason to, pick Pandaren for certain classes and not others. Now, you may have noticed that as a new player, some classes will be greyed out on the character selection screen. These are the unlockable allied races. You can see in my case that I don't have the Horde allied races, for example, as I pretty much only play Alliance, and that's especially true for the last 2 expansions since the allied races became a thing. Don't worry though, these races are all unlocked in game rather than through some paid nonsense, and in fact they're now easier to unlock than they ever have been before. You simply need to complete certain quest chains in the game to unlock each race. In terms of the race themselves, let's start with the Nightborne. Firstly, the Nightborne have a racial active ability that allows them to conjure up an item called an Eldritch Grimoire, which allows you to access your mail for 1.5 minutes. It's basically a convenience feature, and there are other items in the game that do a similar thing, such as Katie's Stamp Whistle, for example, but you likely won't have that item right away as a beginner anyway. Bottom line, it's convenient, it's a nice thing to have. Then we have the big ticket ability for the Nightborne, which is Arcane Pulse, another racial active ability, and this deals 200% of your attack power as arcane damage to nearby enemies, and it slows them by 50% for 12 seconds. So basically it's some area effect damage and a slow, which definitely has its advantages in certain situations. The problem with this ability is that it doesn't really synergize well with most of the classes you can play as Nightborne, which can be a little frustrating. Basically, these classes have other options to use that don't stack with Arcane Pulse, so you wouldn't end up using Arcane Pulse in that given situation. This is just my opinion, of course, so go ahead and do some more research to understand it a little better for yourself. An example of where you might want to use it could be if you were rounding up a bunch of enemies and you wanted to snare them whilst you nuke them down, which could have applications both in the open world and within dungeons. And of course, as I've said many times in this video, unless you're really worried about performance, particularly in rated PvP, then this isn't really a reason not to pick Nightborne. We are, after all, talking about relatively small differences to overall output that really isn't going to impact the majority of content you play as a casual or even semi-casual player. And we can basically zoom through the final 3 passive effects as they're pretty generic, to be honest. Firstly, you get a 15% skill increase for the inscription profession. We've already talked about this kind of bonus. You also have a 1% increase to your magic damage, which is obviously much less useful for some classes than others, but then again, this is one of those RP flavor type racials, as Nightborne have a clear affinity and favour for magic based combat. And again, it's not going to make a noticeable difference for 99% of players. And finally, the Nightborne have a 1% resistance to arcane damage. Now, overall, I don't feel like Nightborne get the best deal, to be honest, especially if you compare them to the Void Elves that the Alliance got, but there you go, let's move on. Our next allied race are the Highmountain Tauren, another flavour of cow essentially. Their big ability is Bull Rush, where they're able to charge forward for 1 second, knocking down enemies for 1.5 seconds. This is effectively an area of effect stun with a 2-minute cooldown. So it's a pretty powerful ability and it has a whole range of use cases. Again, it can give you an edge in PvP by helping you set up for a big burst, or by chaining it with other forms of crowd control to be able to keep your enemy at bay, or maybe you could even use it to interrupt an enemy cast. Like I said, there are many different use cases. Note this is also what makes abilities like the Nightborne ability relatively weak, rather than them just having something inherently wrong with them, though I would argue the Nightborne one probably does have something inherently wrong with it, but it's the strength of other abilities that makes them relatively weak. Anyway, Bull Rush also has uses in PvE. For example, whilst in a dungeon, you have that nice extra stun that could take a bit of pressure off the healer for a couple of seconds, well, for 1.5 seconds. Or you could just use it to stop a whole bunch of enemies from using a specific ability that's going to be particularly detrimental to the group. In summary, it's a really nice racial ability, there's no two ways about it. And also the charge forward helps as well, as it's actually a small gap closer that can come in handy more often than you might expect. Then on the passive side, you have a 15 skill point increase to mining, as well as the ability to mine faster, a convenience feature that's going to save you a little time and give enemies a slightly smaller window to attack you in whilst you're trying to mine. You also get a 1% increase to versatility, so another flat stat increase. Again, you can sim it against other races if you care that much, it'll be negligible. You also have a flat damage reduction, which is nice for all circumstances, particularly when it comes to tanking. As I've mentioned before, I'd be more inclined to look at the utility of active abilities when tanking rather than a minor reduction to damage taken like this, but it's a nice thing to have and the reduction will scale with the level of your character. And finally, you have a chance to loot additional meat and fish, which is actually pretty nice because it'll help you to level cooking, and of course meat and fish are both worth gold, so it's also a little extra cash. Okay, 3 races to go, we're nearly there. The first of our final 3 races are the Mag-har Orcs, and they have an active ability that allows them to increase a random secondary stat. So, haste, crit, mastery or versatility. This is by a flat amount for 15 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. Now, this is actually kind of a weird one because it's random. So you might get the perfect secondary stat for your class, or you might get the other end of the scale and get your weakest secondary stat. So for example, you could pop it in a boss fight, and if your big impact stat is critical strike, then you're going to do a nice additional chunk of damage. But you could just as easily get mastery, and if mastery isn't as valuable to you as crit, then this ability is obviously going to provide less of an impact. Unfortunately, that makes this ability unpredictable, and while there won't be a circumstance where it gives you no bonus whatsoever, it's really going to differ depending on classes, specs, and luck. Some specs will gain a decent bonus from all secondary stats, whereas others are going to heavily favour 1 or 2 individual stats. If you could pick the stat, it would be a much stronger racial, but then I guess it could become too strong, and you'd probably have to drop the amount of secondary stat that's actually given. Anyway, this video is an overview, so I won't be getting into that debate, but basically it's an RNG based stat amp. And frankly, there are better racial active abilities out there, but Mag-har Orcs are cool AF in my opinion, so I'd still play one. They also get a 10% increased in mount speed, which is essentially a nice little time saver when out in the open world, and something that can come handy when, in battlegrounds and facing off against other players. Then you have Savage Blood, which reduces the duration of poisons, diseases and cures by 10%. This is pretty nice as it's just going to reduce the amount of damage you take as well as the amount of time you spend under other harmful effects of these particular debuffs. It's also going to be useful in a broad range of scenarios in both PvE and PvP. For example, a boss is going to do 10% less damage to you with a harmful effect, which in turn is going to save your healers some mana. Or in PvP, it might just make it more difficult for certain classes to kill you. Warlocks spring to mind when it comes to curses. And the final passive you get as a Mag-har Orc is Sympathetic Vigour, which increases pet health by 10%, which is of course great if you're a pet class, but if you're not and you're a warrior for example, then this one is totally useless. Definitely one for the RP flavour list, as that's the only way you can really justify a racial ability only being useful for a handful of classes that are available to that race. Next up we have the Zandalari Trolls, and their main active ability isn't, well, particularly active. It's actually a very unique racial that allows you to pick one of 6 different bonuses, but then you're locked into that bonus for 5 days. Basically, you pick one of the troll lowers, who are sort of troll gods really, to bless you for the duration of 5 days. I'll quickly list the different effects you can have. Number 1, your healing abilities have a chance to put an additional heal on the target, and that amount is variable depending on the stats. Number 2, your damage abilities have a chance to deal shadow damage and heal you for 100% of the damage done. Number 3, you have an increased your movement speed by 5%. Number 4, your damaging abilities have a chance to cause the target to bleed over 6 seconds, which can stack up to 3 times. Number 5, taking damage has a chance to grant you additional health and armor. And number 6, your abilities have a chance to grant you 4% critical strike for 12 seconds. Now, there's definitely some powerful stuff in there, and it will be a bit much to go through all of them and give particular examples, but the key thing to note is that the blessing you go with will be based both on your class and the content you intend to do over that 5-day period. This is often going to result in a compromise because, for example, the blessing you wish to go for PvP may be very different to the one that you want to use for, say, tanking in dungeons. So you can either try to max out in one particular area, or you can go for something that will serve you regardless of the content you're playing during that 5-day period. It's a pretty cool ability, and while I don't play a Zandalari Troll, I think you actually have to go to the shrine to receive the blessing. You certainly did when they first released the race, and I think that's pretty cool from an RP perspective. Also, as a Zandalari Troll, you gain an extra 2% additional gold from looting slain monsters. Now, this seems minor, 2%, but it really can add up if you're farming old dungeons and raids for gold, or if you're just someone who does a lot of farming in general. It's not a bad passive in my opinion, and it will add up over the course of playing the game for months. Then you have the Zandalari Other active ability, which you can use more than once every 5 days. This is the regenerating ability that basically restores 100% of your maximum health over 6 seconds. However, that will be interrupted if you get damaged. Now, this is a pretty nice ability if you utilise it well. The key thing is to ensure that you're not taking ticking damage from a curse or a disease, for example, and that you're not likely to be hit by anything else during the cast. If you can time this well in PvP, for example, then this could totally turn the tide of the battle in your favour. Or you may be able to utilise it and take a bit of pressure off one of your healers during a particularly healing intensive fight. In short, it's a really good ability, but it's one of those that's going to take a little bit of practice to get right. And finally, you have Pterodax Swoop, which allows you to grab a Pterodax and glide for 2 minutes. This is an incredibly cool ability, and it's useful when you're trying to traverse mountainous zones without falling to your death, or maybe trying to evade an enemy in PvP. You could just jump off the ledge and challenge them to follow you. Bear in mind there are other items in game that will allow them to follow you, so I wouldn't get too cocky until you realise whether they've got one or not. And also note that this has a 15-minute cooldown, otherwise it probably would be a little bit too OP and you could just spam it to do silly things. But overall, I'd say Zandalari Trolls have some pretty kick-ass racials, and they might actually be the best implementation of racials that feel both impactful and really in keeping with the fantasy of the race. I'm a big fan. And here we are at our final race, the Vulpera. Their first passive ability gives them 8 additional slots in their backpack, which is handy to have. Extra inventory space is always good. It's not going to be game changing, but it's nice. Another not particularly game changing thing is a 1% resistance to fire. Again, like we've seen throughout this guide, many races have something similar. Not worth worrying about, to be honest. Then their final passive ability means that they basically take a little less damage the first time they're hit. Specifically, it reduces the incoming enemy damage by 5% of your maximum health on the first hit you take from that enemy. This can be pretty annoying for enemy players who are going to hit you with a big opener, or say if you get hit by a big boss ability early on in a fight. It's not one you can necessarily play around that much, as ideally you're not going to get hit by these things at all, but it's a nice bit of protection when you inevitably do. Then in terms of their active abilities, you have Make Camp, which is a unique little bit of flavour and utility for the Vulpera. Basically, you can set up a camp anywhere outdoors and teleport back to it on a 1-hour cooldown. It's basically an extra Hearthstone on a 1-hour cooldown rather than a 30-minute cooldown, but it allows you to have far more flexibility over where you place it. There are a lot of items in the game that allow you to teleport around all over the place, but this one adds a different level of flexibility and it's a cool thing to have in my opinion. And then finally you have the Vulpera signature ability, Bag of Tricks. This is where you hurl a trick at a friend or foe to either help or harm them. Just to clarify, that means harm a foe or help an ally. It would be a pretty useless racial if it was randomised. The damage or healing varies based on your stats, and I'd hope that by this point in the video that the benefits of an extra heal or damage are pretty obvious to you. The key thing to point out here is the fact that you get both the option to damage and to heal, which makes the ability relevant to more situations. Don't go expecting mega damage or healing though. One fun thing about Bag of Tricks that again makes it quite unique is that you can actually unlock some different variations of these abilities by looting items from old raid bosses. They basically change the school of magic of the damage or healing and the visual effects. So yeah, mostly aesthetic really, but pretty cool. And there we go, that's all of them. I really hope this guide was useful. These race guides have definitely ended up taking much longer than I expected. To be honest, there are just so many more races in WoW now and a lot to talk about. And of course you can get way deeper into this if you're interested, but just remember that the underlying message for the vast majority of players is really play what you think is cool and something that has an active ability that you can see yourself using in the game modes that you're most likely to play. Of course, if you want to learn about the Alliance races, then go and watch part 1. I'll link it in the description down below. And there are a bunch of other WoW beginners guides on my channel, and I'll be making plenty more in the future. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then remember to subscribe. Also, remember to hit the bell notification if you actually want to be notified. I have noticed that my videos haven't been going out to my subscribers as much as they should be recently, and it might be because of that. Anyway, thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and yeah, see you next time.